Welcome back. We're going to jump into segment 3 of chapter 2, and we're going to start to see how some of the information that we've gleaned from either chapter 1 or the first part of chapter 2, and try to get some understanding and try to provide some realistic expectations of why you would use that information, not only in this class, but maybe in your future job employments. And we're going to talk about the production possibilities curve. And if you remember, we started off in chapter 2 talking about the production possibilities model. And the curve is just a graphic representation of that model. And the production possibilities curve is built on the fact that everything is scarce. If you remember in chapter 1, we talked about public goods, talked about scarce goods, talked about free goods, and the book focuses on scarce and free goods. And if you remember, the book had a hard time finding very many things other than gravity that were truly a free good. So that's why the authors talk about in the text that everything's scarce. And because everything is scarce, it causes or it drives people to have to make choices, to have to continually make decisions. Take this, I have to give up that. So the production possibilities model is going to teach us, or going to illustrate, I guess is a better phrase, how labor, capital stock, natural resources, technology, entrepreneurship, how everything is pulled together and tied together as the production process takes inputs and turns them into the outputs. And remember, when we're talking about scarcity and opportunity cost, we can't produce an unlimited quantity of goods and services because we're constrained by a limited quantity of factors of production. And one thing that they just briefly talk about in the text, and maybe expanded upon some other texts that you've seen maybe in the past, they talk about a production possibility schedule. And that's nothing more than a schedule of 2 goods and services, tea and coffee, pork and beef. It is the quantities of 2 different goods and services that can be produced using resources. And that schedule, then they show you an example of the schedule in the book. But that schedule, the production possibility schedule, is what is used to generate the production possibilities curve. Or the information in that production possibility schedule is what's used to generate the production possibilities curve. Because the curve is nothing more than a graphical representation of what's in the schedule. And the book talks about a production possibilities curve, a graphical representation of the alternative combinations of goods and services an economy can produce. It shows the trade-offs, trade-off of good A, trade-off of good B, and it's all being driven by what? Being driven by scarcity. It's being driven by choice. And it basically means more of A means less of B. More of B means less of A. And when they're setting up the production possibilities curve, remember, economists use assumptions and they refer to them as simplifying assumptions, to help manage the complexity of the world that they have to function in. So on the production possibilities curve, like any good model generated curve or graphical representation, there are only 2 goods or services in the economy. Good A, good B, coffee, tea, computers, televisions. In the book, I think they use skis, snowboards. But, to produce, some of skis, you have to produce fewer snowboards. So there are only 2 goods in the economy. Labor, capital, natural resources are fixed. Can't change them in this particular time period. And you know what else is fixed? Technology and entrepreneurship is fixed. So if you think of all your factors of production, they are fixed in this particular time period that they're talking about on this production possibilities curve. And if you look at a production possibilities curve, if you look at the one in the textbook where they're talking about the production of skis and snowboards, they're talking about individual production entities, I think 3 different factories. And if you look, those production possibilities curves are linear. They're linear. They're connecting the y-axis to the x-axis. And it's a linear representation of what's in that production possibility schedule. If you take all of the entities generating or producing snowboards or producing skis and combine them into an economy-based production possibilities curve, it goes from a linear representation to a bowed out representation. It's bowed out from the origin. Remember, if you've ever had, like in your math classes, when you're talking about, the intersection of the x and y axis, that's usually referred to as the origin. So you've got your vertical axis, you've got your horizontal axis, and that production possibilities curve is bowed outward. And that is because you add enough of those linear production possibilities curves together, you'll start smoothing it out and get a bowed out production possibilities curve. And the absolute value of the slope of the production possibilities curves measures the opportunity cost of an additional unit of X in terms of the quantity of the quantity of the y-axis. So we're talking about opportunity cost. So it goes back to the kind of the underpinnings of the building blocks of what the economist uses, or what you're going to learn in your economics text. You're talking about scarcity, you're talking about opportunity cost, you're talking about choice, you're talking about trade-offs. And those building blocks, that's why they're so important, as we learned in chapter 1. They're going to be used throughout the chapters of this text as we move forward. And again, if you're talking about individual markets, it may be a linear production possibility curve. If you take those and combine all of those markets together into an economy, we're going to get a bowed out curve. And they talk at that point about comparative advantage. In producing a good or service, if the opportunity cost of producing that good or service is lower for that economy than any other economy, and you think about just think about comparative advantage in your normal life. If you think about, just think about breakfast this morning. Let's say you had breakfast this morning and you had a banana, you had some kind of fruit. Let's say you had a banana for breakfast. Bananas, the comparative advantage of producing bananas, at least for the United States, is going to typically be, they're going to be imported from somewhere in South America because they have the climate, they have the land available, and bananas they have a comparative advantage in producing bananas. If you think in the United States, when you're thinking about citrus growers, think about where a lot of your citrus is grown. Southern California, Rio Grande Valley in Texas, Florida, just within the contiguous United States, those states have comparative advantage of growing citrus crops. They talk about comparative advantage a little later on in the text. Agriculture, comparative advantage. United States has got a comparative advantage over most countries in the world because we have the technology, we have the expertise, we have the land available. We've spent millions of dollars, genetically improving the ability to grow crops, to develop disease resistance crops. So we have a comparative advantage in agriculture here in the United States. They talk about Singapore has a comparative advantage when it comes to commerce. Taiwan may have a comparative advantage when it comes to producing computer chips. Each country has a comparative advantage. Used to be, if you wanted a really good bottle of wine, especially red wine, the comparative advantage was France. I mean, that's where most of your really, really, really nice red wines came from. But now there may be an argument that you may get, that Napa Valley in Northern California has a comparative advantage in producing excellent red wines. You're getting excellent, Malbecs out of, South America. So They're just comparative advantages, and that's what this production possibilities curve is going to show you. Because, and we'll get into it again a little later, but if you are producing on that production possibilities curve, you're going to have a comparative advantage in producing whatever good or service we're talking about. Production possibilities curve also talks about the law of increasing opportunity cost. As an economy moves along the PPC, production possibilities curve, where it connects with the y-axis, you go down where it connects with the x-axis. It's what it's talking about, moving along that curve. In the direction of producing more of a particular good, the opportunity cost of additional units of that good will increase. That's because the bowed out shape it's talking about, it reflects the law of increasing opportunity cost. The negative slope of the production possibilities curves, as we've talked about, reflects scarcity and trade-offs when we're talking about good A is produced or compared to good B, or good X compared to good Y. And if we're looking at movements along that PPC, we're talking about combinations of two different goods and services. Again, tea and coffee, bananas and automobiles. And you're talking about, if you want to talk economy-wise, and I think the example they use in the text, they're talking about after 9/11, they're talking about security services on one axis and all other goods and services on the bottom axis. But again, it's showing the trade-off, those opportunity costs of between all other goods and services and economy produces and security that was driven by the aftermath of 9/11. And you're also talking as you move along that production possibilities curve, you're talking about closer to the endpoint, you're talking about the low-hanging fruit. And again, they keep banging on the production possibilities curve. It is a graphical representation of scarcity, trade-offs, opportunity cost, and choice. Choice among production processes, choice, and at the end of the day, choices among consumers. And then they talk about the production possibilities curve and points off and on. So as I said earlier, if you're on that production possibilities curve, you have a competitive advantage over other individuals in that economy, or the economy itself has a comparative advantage of other economies maybe within the world. So, you know, producing agricultural products in the United States, you may be right there on that production possibilities curve. Points outside of the production possibilities curve at this point in time are unattainable. And why are they unattainable? Factors of production are fixed. You can't increase the factors of production to move farther out past the current production possibilities curve. If you are inside the production possibilities curve, you're talking about either not full employment of all your factors of production, or the technology and the entrepreneurship that you have available in that production process is not efficiently incorporating those factors of production in the production process. So if you're inside that bowed out production possibilities curve, you may either not be fully employing all your resources, your factors of production, or the production process that you're using is not as efficient as it could be. And again, the book that the text keeps going on about, it is, you know, the production possibilities curve provides that graphical representation of combinations of two goods and services that can be produced. And if you're on the curve, you've got comparative advantage, you've got full employment of your factors of production, and your technology and your entrepreneurship is working efficiently because you're setting out there on the curve. Remember, to be on that, and a point that you can't stress enough is to be on that production possibilities curve. Resources, factors of production are being utilized, and they call it full employment. It's not talking about the employment of just the labor factor of production. It's talking about full employment in the production process of all your factors of production. Or you're talking, and it's not an or, it's an and, you are producing efficiently. And then they talk about the failure to utilize all factors of production. It could be a situation in which all the factors of production that aren't available or under current market conditions are not being utilized. Could be you're working in a shop that may be driven by laws or regulations. You may have a union contract that impacts the utilization of the full employment of some of your factors of production. So especially if you think about some of the countries, well, let's take France. There are certain laws and regulations, and I'll go back to the example of producing wine. Certain laws and regulations in France that you can only produce certain types of wine. If you produce champagne, it's got to be in the Champagne region of France. Anything outside of the Champagne region is called sparkling wine. So there are laws and regulations that may not allow a particular economy to produce out on that production possibilities curve because you can't fully utilize all your factors of production. And when they talk about in the text, they talk about inefficient production. It's a misallocation of resources or a misallocation of factors of production within that production process. And you're operating on the PPC. If you're efficiently producing goods and services, you're operating inside that PPC. If you're not efficiently producing those goods and services, because it implies there is a waste of your goods and services. And then we kind of, the text and the authors kind of move into specialization. And specialization, it's I like the way they tied into the production possibilities curve, because it says it's a situation in which an economy is producing the goods and services in which it has at a comparative advantage. It is devoting the resources. It results in greater well-being and greater material wealth for not only that economy, but maybe for other economies around the world, depending on the import-export process, which you would get into if you were taking a macro class. It has created, and they talk about specialization, has created the wealth and the standard of living that we enjoy today, not only in the United States, but in other areas of the world. Economic growth, and they talk about economic growth was stagnant until about 1600. And then economists start talking about, or maybe not so much economists, but they start changing and they start improving production processes, and they start expanding growth, and they start exploiting competitive advantage. And again, competitive advantage, specialization. U.S. specializes in agricultural products. Hong Kong specializes in commerce. Taiwan may specialize in, computer chips. France, even though there's competition, they still have a competitive advantage, especially in producing champagne, because champagne can't be produced anywhere else in the world other than the Champagne region in France. It can't be called champagne. You can use the champagne-like process in other countries in the world or other regions in the world, but it has to be designated sparkling wine. Great sparkling wines coming out of California. Cava out of Spain is a really nice sparkling wine, but it can't be called champagne. So, and then they get into talking about the Scottish philosopher, talking about Adam Smith, and some academicians will talk about Adam Smith as being the first truly great economist. You will get into it a little later, and I guess it's chapter 3 and 4 maybe. He came up with, he developed the text called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. That was his seminal text, and that's what got things started. And, talks about, he's been, attributed to, at least it's attributed to him when he talks about the invisible hand, that there are market forces out there that are going to ensure that the supply and demand curves eventually end up in equilibrium with an equilibrium price and quantity. And again, we'll get into that, I think, in chapter 3. But he also focused on the division of labor as specialization. He was maybe the first proponent of specializing and specialization, because specialization is what drives economic growth, economic development, gives us the standard of living that, again, not only that we enjoy here in the United States today, but is enjoyed by millions of people in populations all around the world. That's going to kind of wrap up segment 3 for us. We've talked about in segment 1, we talked about the production possibilities model. Then we talked about factors of production in segment 2. Segment 3, we talked about production possibilities curve, how it's a graphical representation of the production possibilities table, and how it's incorporating these scarce resources and what it means to be outside that the bowed out curve, production possibilities curve, what it means to be on the curve and what it means to be inside the curve. And then as we move into the next segment of chapter 3, we're going to be talking about some applications of the PPC. And I think segment 4 actually wraps up chapter 2 for us. So we've got one more segment, and I'll stop here, and we'll be back and we'll talk about segment 4 in a few minutes. Talk to you soon.